Hi, welcome back to the Mom Mentality Show. My name is Austin Chadwick and co-host is Chris Lucian. And today, excited to have Jon Reid with us on the show to hit some awesome topics, including discovery trees for visualizing work, iOS development and technical practices along with those, and finally working on an XP team. So I know Jon was excited to share about that. But before we jump into those, Jon, do you mind giving us a little bit of an introduction to yourself?
Oh, the short version is I'm the author of iOS unit testing by example and currently work as a coach and trainer at Industrial Logic. And most of my development experience has been in Apple land, whatever that has been over the years.
Nice. Fantastic. Fantastic. Yeah, I'm excited to jump into kind of the mobile technical practices. But before we do that, I'm really curious, also really curious about this, visualizing work with discovery trees. It's been something, visualizing work has become very handy to me with mob programming and such. So I'm curious what you got here. What's on your mind?
Well, it's funny. You had Dustin Thostenson on
Yes.
a few weeks ago, and he name dropped me and mentioned a thing, but he forgot the name of it, which was Discovery Tree. So Dustin and I were working together, coaching together. And I happened to read this blog post by Quinn Gill and Ron Cortell called Discovery Trees. And they are part of the crew in Seattle around Fast Agile. And so I was very curious because, it's like, I love learning. I want to keep getting new ideas from folks as they find good things. And I read it and I thought, this is interesting. So I gave it a try just by myself, coding personally in a live coding streaming thing, which I do on Twitch. And it was interesting. I learned some things about it. And I happen to also work with Steve Kuo and Paige Watson at Industrial Logic, who are also part of that Seattle, part of sort of Ron's, posse, I guess. And what it is basically, it's like both lighter and deeper than user stories on a card. Traditionally you'd write out like a card with just a title on it, and except there are a lot of pieces to anything, to any story. There are always lots of pieces, and so it doesn't seem like a revolutionary idea, but it's a simple, effective idea to just have like, okay, let's put the top card at the top, and now what are the main components of that? Like, what are the main things we need to do to get this done? Well, you break those down into the next tree and you say, okay, so what are we going to start with first? And you say, okay, this subsection, for example, maybe it's, we need to upload some data. Okay, what do we need to do that? And you start breaking that down and put some cards under that until you finally get to something that's like, okay, here's something we can probably knock out in, the next round. And I like it very much. I think what I like about it is the tree shape, that it moves away from things in a flat list. Adding the extra dimension means you can have that breakdown. And it's very natural, very easy to understand. And when Dustin and I shared it with Dustin, and he said, let's use this with the client we were working with, because the developers we had a tendency to get lost in the weeds, really like, oh, what about this and what about that, and and so I said, okay, let's focus by deciding what is it that we're going to work on right now.
Yeah.
Well, it's this piece. Okay, what do we need to do that piece? Well, we need to do this. I'm like, great. Go ahead and put those down. And now you can get them out of your mind. It's kind of like, I don't know if you guys are into getting things done, GTD. David Allen's sort of technique of he says your brain is for having ideas, not for keeping track of ideas. And so it's like, get the thing out of your head, whatever the details are, so that you can then not worry about them. Because otherwise your brain is spending a lot of energy, like these developers were doing, saying, oh, we can't forget about this particular thing. Like it's got to have this key or these credentials or whatever the details are. So I'm liking it a lot and also using it now as I code.
Oh, Chris, you're muted.
Can you go through, maybe just for everybody, what it's like to create one of these, or I guess like what's the conversation like? How did it, how does it emerge? Because I mean, so I think this is very similar to maybe discussion trees and other things, other tree form diagramming systems. But maybe for people to visualize who are listening, what process did you go through to create it? Is there a process of decomposition, all that stuff?
I think it's as light or as heavy as you need it to be, much as, like any of our lightweight tools, you don't want too much and you don't want too little. Our process right now, in the team that I'm actively coding in now, not as a coach, but as a coder, is we pick the next story. Okay. And it's just sort of a open space. It's a rectangle in a virtual whiteboard. And we slap down the first card and say, what do we need to do this? And have a conversation. It's also where I find now it's getting a little confusing to me on the story that we're currently on, is that the initial cards came about from conversation with the company that we're coding for. It's like, how does this feature how do you want this to actually work? And a whole bunch of details came out, and we tried to slap them down, but we haven't done real good curation on this particular one. And we've ended up with here's an important thing. How you show work in progress in a virtual whiteboard. It's as easy as changing the color of the card. So if you have like a little note that's like, these are things to do, and that's one color, and the like light yellow is what we're using. And when we start work on something, we change it to an orange color. So you should be able to see, ideally, in a tree from the top down through to the leaf node of what you're actively working on. What is the work in progress? Mm-hmm. And somebody can see it at the top level, like a manager could breeze in and say, I don't care about the details. I just want to see, okay, you're working on this facet of this feature. Got it. Whereas for the developer, it's like, okay, we're down here at this leaf, and it's all going to come together. And then when they're done, mark them green, mark blockers red, mark questions and something else. It's probably similar to a lot of other things. There are also, I think, similarities to the Mikado method in a way, except that the Mikado method is really about, like, you discover the work to be done and then you do a hard reset, so that you can start from the leaves backwards. And this doesn't prescribe that, but they can fit together.
Your story about teams kind of going off on tangents and things reminded me of an experience, and we actually used a very similar technique. There was but this was for a product owner that was having a hard time kind of articulating everything that they wanted, and would often go into the weeds on something that wasn't, or revisit something over and over and over again that was already on, discussed. And so we used kind of discussion mapping, and worked through basically like, oh, we've already talked about that, see, it's already on the map. And it was a tree. It kind of started from like a root node and broke out. And so there's something very, very elegant about trees and mapping conversations that way.
Nice. Yeah. And I think I'll throw in that I love the sharing of this discovery tree. It's fantastic. And what's so cool about it is that I think there's like different things, like you're saying, in the same ballpark that we've kind of stumbled upon that have very similar uses and benefits. And for lack of a better term, I'll just call it discovery drawing, because it's just like almost completely free form in the sense of just, hey, what are we working on? Or, hey, how do we share with someone else what we're working on? And we just get on a whiteboard or digital tool of some kind and just start drawing, and how much good comes from that. And one thing that some of the teams I've been on, we've called it like graphic Kanban. And it sounds like discovery trees have this aspect of it too, is that it shows what's completed versus what's in progress. And so we just end up start drawing things. And I love how the discovery trees you talked about too had prioritization, because that's key, right? Because you could break down, a big thing into medium-sized things and feel like, oh, this next medium-sized thing is the next thing to work on. And that's very important from a lean perspective to do in a particular way, because a bad thing would be to break a giant thing into 1,000 little things without prioritizing as you go, because you might be breaking down something you never work on, right? Because it's low priority. So I think, as with many of these things, how it's drawn and facilitated could be very lean and extreme
or
programming,
not,
or the opposite.
Right?
Yeah. So
it's just a tool. It doesn't have very strong opinions about vertical slicing.
Yeah. So what are some have you ever seen it misused and gone sideways, and how did you help bring it back?
More like right now, I feel lost on the current tree we're on, because it's not exactly, it's got like, here's a work in progress, and here's a work in progress, and here's a work in progress. And there are all these different nodes. And actually it probably shows that the tree is malformed. And when I get off of here with you guys, I'm going to probably go back and start reshaping that,
tinkering around with it.
Say, no, okay, what's related to what here? Because it just sort of spewed out as a bunch of details. And I think part of it is, and it's in the name discovery, is that you don't have to put down all the details. If you have a detail in your head, by all means get it out, like stick it down somewhere. But you don't have to. You can say that will come later. Let's not worry about it now. Here's what we're focusing on. How do we break this down? The next node.
Nice. No, that's good. And I think the discovery is a really good name for that. I like that piece of it a lot, because that makes it clear that this isn't another way to draw a waterfall plan, And so that's quite fantastic. And actually, I would be curious to dive deeper into this, but I'm also curious to not run out of time, and I want to get to some of your other topics. So I think let's switch gears, and how about we jump into iOS development and technical practices? What's on your mind here, John?
Yeah. So I am kind of an odd animal in iOS land. that there aren't too many of us that I've encountered who are into the technical practices. There is, and you actually, a question I wanted to ask you. I'll describe what I see in the iOS community, and I'm curious: is this peculiar to the iOS group, or is it more widespread? And that is that there is a fascination with like language particulars and like, there's obviously, you want to get good at iOS, of course you do, but that becomes the sole focus. And I think the emphasis is on the created artifacts, that is the source code as outcome, rather than on the creating part of it. The act of creating, I think, has gotten lost. There doesn't seem to be a lot of conversation around, okay, so if you want to make a particular view, what are the steps to go about making that view, as opposed to here's what the final outcome looks like, and everyone just sort of copies it. And so I'm curious, do you see that in other communities as well, that focus on the created rather than the creating?
I think so. So I'd say that XP practitioners maybe are typically language and platform agnostic, in my experience when I run into them. So and then I think that this idea of so I believe the iOS ecosystem is very it's very dense in the sense that it has a lot of gravity. It sucks people in, and so there's a lot to learn, and it's very particular to iOS. And so in my experience, when I'm kind of comparing it to other things, I think platforms, because I think that Microsoft does this too, in a sense, and some of the other bigger languages out there that are funded by corporations, they try and it's almost kind of like a vendor lock-in a little bit, in my opinion. And so learning those specifics, it might actually be something of a corporate strategy. Like they are introducing language specifics that are substantially different than other companies to make it harder to switch off of their platform. And so and I think XP practitioners often will, are forced to work in different languages or work across. And so there's this, I think that there's like a vast majority of software developers out there are maybe specialized in an area and focused on the language that they operate in. And then I think there's another group that is more interested in longevity or code quality over time. So it's like producing versus maintaining, and not necessarily producing as much, but making sure that it lives for a long time. And I think that those are fairly opposed learning paths. And I think the producing path is the one taught most frequently, or at least has been maybe in the last however long, but more recently has been shifting towards more of a thought of longevity. But whenever I talk to an academic about teaching things about code, it's one thing that I point out often is that in a university, students are given a project and they have to just crank it out as fast as they can. And then once that semester is done, they never think about it ever again, and then throw it away. Like all code is
they're
throw
well
away.
Suited for the corporate culture then.
Yeah, exactly. And so one thing I like to use the ship of Theseus analogy. So the ship of Theseus, the idea that the planks of wood on a ship are gradually replaced over time, and due to maintenance and things, is it the same ship? I think of that as in terms of software teams. So you know, your software product lives for decades, and the people, like the planks of wood, are regularly rotating through and being replaced over time, either through retirement or moving on to another opportunity or whatever. And so most software, I think, being worked on today is not being worked on by the original team that started it at all, right? They've long since retired. And so I think there's this, I think people gradually learn that things like XP are important because longevity becomes a focus later in their career. And earlier, no one's taught about this stuff. So I think that's where it might be coming from. That was a lot of thoughts all at once. I'm sorry.
And unfortunately, Apple brings its history, its culture with it, where the original in the old days, there was one customer, and that was Steve Jobs.
Yeah.
And that's all that mattered, was pleasing him. In fact, he had a special category in the bug database for things reported by him. But XP was not part of their culture. I know there's a group inside that's working to try to spread these ideas internally, but they have a tough slog. And Apple itself puts out a lot of tutorials and sample code, and how, like even walkthroughs in their famous annual WWDC videos now that they make, where it's like, look, watch me like make this, and people are like, ooh, it's like in how few keystrokes can create this this game or whatever it is, and not a lot of thought about like, how is it designed, how is it testable, how is it coupled or loosely coupled, and things like that. In fact, some of their examples lean so far into like, here's a class that does half a dozen things and is tightly coupled, and they put it out there to sort of show off the strength of this programming language, their programming language, and their platform. It's like, great, good for you.
So,
and it's intended to be like, people should receive it in that spirit, I think. And if you do, it's great. There's a lot to learn. Take it apart, learn from it. But people, because it comes from Apple, assume then this is the way.
Yeah. So I think a lot of language features in Apple produced languages are actually again, I might roast me in the comments for this, but I think I've seen a history of language features and systematic features from Apple products to be vendor lock-in mechanisms. You have to understand esoteric certificating processes to be able to publish, right? And it's like, oh, it's not that certificate, it's this other certificate. A lot of that, it kind of creates a fear of like moving on to something else. And I think that that there's a little bit of that inside of the Apple ecosystem, but because I think it's just like the iPhone, right? Their language features are also meant to be, very like sexy, and I'm gonna just do this all for you so you don't have to think about it. And I think that long living software products is not sexy to people getting into programming. So I think it's a combination of get all the new people and then make them afraid to change. And which is kind of the iPhone strategy, but I think that's reflected in the code as well. So again, personal opinion disclaimer here, but I've done some iOS development, and I've also written for other platforms, and I think that the pattern that I've seen is that it's just it's the Apple marketing strategy baked into their tooling. And so, yeah, there's a lot of really cool stuff about it, but I don't, again, systematically, I think that this starts as a problem with our education system. New developers are not being taught the value of XP, and it's hard for them to see the value of XP because they don't know, they've never experienced a project longer than a semester or two. And so, what I think universities should have students learning on is, their assignments should be written as a component of a long living code base. And, that code base could be architected in a way that allows for extension by students that would, gradually take on their assignments as some larger functioning machine. So, because I think by the time students are out of school, most of them have no idea that a majority of the software they're writing will be a small percentage of some larger system that will live decades past the end of their career. That had lived before decades before the beginning of their career. So, I think that the educational system lines them up, and then Apple attracts them and then locks them in. And I think Microsoft does this too. I don't think this is exclusive to Apple, because there are things in Microsoft that do the same thing. And other like corporate sponsored stuff. Like I think like Angular, Google and Angular do this a lot as well. They just call things different names so that when you're searching for it with the real name, it's you don't know, right, like the official name for it. So
I guess, as someone who lives in the crossroads between XP and iOS development, I would make two appeals. One is to any iOS developers who are watching this show. If you're like hearing about this thing XP for the first time, come learn what it is. It is so good. And for XP enthusiasts, hey, maybe like next time you get a chance to work on an iOS project, jump in or adopt someone who is, like mentor someone who is. And I really think that we're in danger of losing the art of creating something rather than just ending up with a bunch of artifacts that happen to work today.
Yeah. And I'm not a super extensive mobile developer, but I mean, I've got a couple years in my belt. And what's interesting is, given the context, we're doing mob programming, we're seeking to do extreme programming. And so we've always approached mobile development from what things exist that allow craftsmanship and test-driven development things to be built in. And so I'm a very strange animal in the forest when it comes to iOS development, because I'm used to picking platforms where it's easy to test, and there's less duplicate code. It'll transpile to iOS and Android, so you don't have to write it twice, and things like that. And I know that's less common, but I think I feel I've seen the XP Lite partway through my career, and it really was such a huge game changer in making my life as a developer way less painful and way more enjoyable. But once I've seen that, you kind of see it from a system perspective, right? And so from a system perspective, and I think you're hitting at this, Chris and John, is that from a clean architecture and system perspective, vendors are doing what they're incentivized to do. They're trying to sell product and have people use their product, right? So of course they're going to make a tutorial that's geared towards that, and not necessarily towards maintainability, right? So, but from a clean architecture perspective, every vendor, every language, every library you pull in, it's all an implementation detail. It is not the heart of any system you're making, right? Mm-hmm. But and also when you're coming into the market, that's the kind of cool, exciting stuff, is like to learn how all the the implementation details. And so I think a combination of all those things leads to this thing where, not until you've experienced a lot of pain that you start looking for, is there another way to do this? So, yeah. Yeah. And so what, I guess, we've kind of talked about the problem a little bit, and maybe before we switch topics to the last thing, what has been your experience with technical practices in iOS development? What differences has it made for you as an iOS developer?
There's certainly been some battles, like along the way. I've written the tools that I wanted.
Yeah.
When it was possible.
Sure.
It was easier in Objective-C days to create new things, because of the nature of a dynamic language made things like I wrote the Objective-C version of Makito because I wanted it. But I think the biggest barrier that people get used to not fighting is feedback time. The length of the feedback loop. Is people working in Swift get used to long compiles, and once it goes up to a build server, it's usually even slower than your local server, because the build machines they're just using cheap virtual whatever, or they're running on Mac Minis, right? They're not the nice M1 or better MacBook Pros that are super fast and optimized. And so that's slow. And people get used to it. Mm-hmm. People just get used to saying, oh, well, now I'm going to, let my mind wander, or I'll while I'm waiting, I'll start something else, and increase my whip, or I'm just gonna get bored and start scrolling Twitter, or no, Mastodon. That's where I am now. Come find me on Mastodon. And so I think the main battle for me has been finding ways to decrease that feedback time. Like really being aggressive about even fractions of a second.
Love it. Yeah. And that's, to me, that is so huge, because it's, if I've ever been a team or a mob or ensemble where, that build time, no matter what the tech's being used, is slow, it leads to so many, it makes it easy to lead to so many anti-patterns, right? And if you can really speed up that feedback loop, for build, for test, for all the things, it makes such a phenomenal difference in developer experience, right? Because it becomes more fun. It's like, oh, let's try this, let's try that, let's try this, let's try that. Oh, revert that. All right, push that. Oh, now the customer's using it. Like everything's just humming. And I think if you've never experienced it, you're kind of like, oh, well, that's, you just wait a while, and that's how it always is, and so, so I'm very excited about that becoming more of a thing in all mobile development, including iOS. And so I'm really excited what you're bringing to the community. So keep bringing it. And I guess maybe to transition to one of our last topics, the joys of XP, bringing that to iOS development. And now you're finally working on an XP team. So tell us about that.
It's kind of funny because, so my journey with XP has been that I learned about it years ago. Started reading on the C2 wiki about it and trying to apply as much as I could, but it was all the solo practices that I could do for the longest time. It was just, the coding stuff. And I even went to, this is decades ago, I went to a talk where a guy was talking about XP, and I went up afterwards, where can I find any place that works like this, please? And it was a very slim list. and so along the way, as I got better at the coding practices, and I started teaching about it, and I started teaching workshops, which consisted of everyone following along on their own computer coding, and then I'd run around and help with questions. I happened to take a workshop from someone you may know named Llewellyn Falco.
Nice.
And he used this completely other style of mobbing. And I was like, what in the world? This is fantastic. And so that changed how I did teaching, how I did workshops. I used it from there on out, loved it, so effective. And then started, that was the only context I had for what mobbing was like, was only in a workshop setting. So I never had it for real work until a few weeks ago. I guess it's been a couple months now. There are a few of us at Industrial Logic who, instead of teaching or coaching, are actually on a gig for a client. And so naturally, we're going to work the way we want to work. And it's like, okay, we're going to have dynamic teaming. We're going to have mobs. And I walked in there and it was like my beginner's mind lit on fire, because all these things that I've taught and that I've taught teams, these are good for you. And I've, taught them how to rotate and stuff, basic stuff like that. Experiencing it has been a different deal for me to realize it's like Morpheus in the Matrix, right? It's one thing to know the way, it's not the same as walking the way, or something like that. And it's interesting that my first experience on this should be remote. Because for the longest time, people said, well, pairing can't work remotely. Well, absolutely it can. Well, this other thing, mobbing, it can't work. Well, absolutely it can. And it's the only experience I have now. Part of the joy has been to discover things like, if I need to step out because I need to use the restroom, or my wife needs me for just a few minutes, I just say bye and I leave. And the work keeps going.
Yeah.
The work keeps going. It was just so amazing to come back and realize nothing stopped while I was away. This was a revelation for me. So I'm also we're doing trunk-based development. This is, again, my first time to experience what that's like. And for folks watching or listening, basically the industry has adopted pull requests as the way to code, and it's unfortunate because pull requests was invented and is useful to accept code from people who are not on your team, from people who you don't know who they are, people who may not have the context you have. It's like an anti-team. It's deliberately an anti-team procedure.
Born in the open source space, right?
Yeah,
It's
great
all
for that.
You can't trust the person, so you have to, right? There's a lot of stuff that's just built around mechanisms to prevent hackers from doing things and stuff, right?
We don't want to accept changes.
Yeah.
Who knows what you'll push? And so getting in there to where the alternative, again, this is probably not new for any of your listeners, but I imagine I'm going to bring anyone I can, of course, to watch this episode from the iOS side of things, to say you don't have to work in a system that was designed to inhibit people from actually working together. You don't have to. You can actually talk. And then when it's good and you're green, your tests are good, you push. And if it's like, oh, you're out of date,
Mhm.
someone else pushed, that's okay. You pull.
Yeah.
And stuff going up in, it's funny, the rule of thumb for like what is continuous integration, they say, yeah, a developer integrates into the main branch once a day. And I'm thinking, wow, that I think is just, it's like marketing speak to appeal to people who are used to only getting in like once a week.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. It's every few minutes.
Oh yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, yeah.
Well, the
It's
funny thing is that
completely different.
I think that just to kind of riff off of that, uh, the branching strategies that we have today, I think, have all been based off of teams that just had a hard time following like solid principles, right? Um, and other things like that, where they're working in the same file, right? Mega files. And I think just mobbing in general, XP teams doing mobbing don't end up making files that are thousands of lines long, and therefore don't end up working at the same time as other mobs on the same file in those thousands of lines. So you don't get merge conflicts. And merge conflicts were a big reason, I think, why branching became popular in the first place. And so it's almost like the entire industry has forgotten what it's like to work in a solid code base that is decoupled and highly cohesive, right? Or maybe that just never existed. But I think that mobbing naturally tends to make files smaller because people are trying to make it so they can hold less in their head, and you naturally implement design patterns which allow you to extend easier without working on the same file. That leads to not having merge conflicts, which leads to a absence of a need for branching, which leads to trunk-based development, which leads to faster integration, which leads to fewer bugs, right? Like there's just so much good that just kind of naturally kind of flows out over time. So love it.
It all clips together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Something else I wanted to mention about my experience is that there are folks who, even if they're like in a virtual room, as we are right now, they keep their cameras off because, and there's been all this new literature or stories about people getting like Zoom fatigue and all that. And I read a great tip from Martin Fowler recently that I didn't know about, where it's like you hide yourself. So right now, I'm looking at my screen, I see you two. I'm not looking at my face, and therefore being distracted by like, oh, how do I look? And stuff like that. And I tried it as an experiment, and I found, oh gosh, this really does keep me more energized, and I don't feel as tired by worrying about how I look, and it's more natural. It's much more like a simulation of being in the same room with you two, rather than being in the same room and looking at my mirror.
Yeah. No, that's good. Yeah, use those tools. Why not? And
that's all day long. We're coding like this.
I used to go around the office with a mirror, and every time I talk to somebody, I just stare at myself while talking to them. And it was actually really effective at simulating the remote experience.
Chris really wanted badly to do remote mobbing. Yeah.
and one more thing on top of that is I've seen companies, especially in the pandemic age where everyone went remote, where people felt lonely and isolated, and they had to set up these like social hours or game times or whatever. It's like, well, what if you were actually like in the same room, and it doesn't all have to be about work. You could like tell a joke or share something about your life. I'm finding I'm socializing a lot.
Yeah.
Where I never did in the corporate siloed environment.
Yeah. Yeah, we are coming up on time, but maybe I'll try to tie it all together because I feel like there's this overarching theme kind of all coming together here, which is, because I find the same thing. If you're embrace, your inner humanity at all before you start coding, you usually say like, "Oh, how was your day? What are you doing tomorrow? Or how was your vacation?" And you get that socializing for free, right? And the jokes for free. But I see with the discovery trees, the technical practices, being on an XP team, mobbing, trunk-based development, I feel like all these things tie together to make like a fun, fast feedback, iOS development or whatever you're developing, right? Like all this goodness kind of comes together. But in light of time, I'm going to turn it over to Chris to help us close down here.
Yeah. So, John, do you have anything that you want to plug or share before we close the episode out?
Sure. At Industrial Logic, I teach workshops, usually in private for companies, but there's a public one coming up that's for iOS developers or for people wanting to get into iOS developing. So people can go check that out, and maybe it's probably something you want to expense. So ask your company to send you. And on the cheap side, there's my book, iOS Unit Testing by Example.
Fantastic.
All right. And to our audience, if you know somebody working in iOS who has not yet seen the light of XP style programming, or maybe somebody new to the industry that could do well to hear about these topics, then please share this episode with them. If you want to blast me for all the things that I said about the Apple languages, then please leave that in the comments. I'd appreciate that, and I can reply. And like and subscribe and all that, and we'll see you all next time. And thanks, John, for joining us, and bye, everybody.
Bye.